바로 이어서 두 번째 연사 강연 소개로 넘어가 볼 텐데요. 현재 ALA 건축 스튜디오 대표로 계시는 영국 출신의 건축가입니다. 아만다 레베트 연사인데요. 영국의 하이테크 건축을 대표하는 퓨처 시스템스의 대표로 역임을 하셨고요. 영국의 3대 랜드마크로 꼽히는 버밍햄의 랜드마크, 셀프리지 백화점, 또 M+ 퍼빌리언, 방콕 센트럴 엠버시, 리스본의 매트 미술관, 런던 빅토리아 앤 앨버트 뮤지엄의 새로운 출입문과 지하 갤러리 설계와 같이 정말 유수의 다수의 대형 프로젝트로 세계적인 명성을 떨치고 계신 분입니다. 팬데믹 상황으로 직접 모시지 못하고 영상으로 모시게 된 점 양해 부탁드리면서 Architecture Really Matters, 건축의 중요성이라는 주제로 이야기 펼쳐주실 아만다 레베트님의 강연 지금부터 만나보시죠.
Hi, I'm Amanda, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm going to talk about the work of my practice, ALA, in the context of some of the most pressing issues of today, which I know is the theme of your conference. This is the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology in Lisbon. It's on the bank of the River Tagus, from where the great explorers set off, and it's an amazing sight. You can literally see in the pattern of the water that moment where river becomes ocean. And we wanted to capture this very outward-looking characteristic of the city, and yet Lisbon is cut off from its waterfront by train tracks and a highway. So our first thought was, could we design a building to help reconcile a city cut off from its waterfront? Our first move then was to persuade the energy company, our client, EDP, that we also needed to design a bridge over the highway to connect the museum back to the city. We identified a small square on the other side of the train tracks from where we could span over the road without any need for steps and land on the roof of the museum. Now, arguably, this simple urban move was more important than the architectural ones, and it actually became the generator for the entire design. We not only made it easy to get to the museum, but we created a new public space on the roof. And this is the opening weekend of the museum, when 80,000 people, that's almost 15% of the population of Lisbon, congregated on the roof and along the riverfront. And it's now one of the most visited museums in Portugal. The roof of the museum is like an elevated town square, and it's part of the Riverside Walk. It's both a destination and a wonderful vantage point to look out across the water. But maybe more importantly even, is to look back towards the city, because it gives you a completely new perspective of its urban context. Perhaps what we didn't do is as important as what we did do. Very untypically for an architect, we did not build as high as we could have done. Counterintuitive it is, maybe, because it meant sinking the exhibition spaces partly below the water table. But by designing a very low-slung building, we preserved what's important: the views from the city to the water and from the river back to the city. This museum's for big art. In the oval space here is an installation by the artist Hector Zamora, and it's from here that you enter all the other galleries. where one space blends into the next, because this is a museum where three disciplines come together. And here the gallery is animated by natural light with a roof light designed to only let in north light. And where you can look up and see the sky and the ceramic tiles on the underside of the self-shading overhang. Our focus here was on the waterfront, making places to sit close to the water with steps that go down to the river and where you can take shade from the overhanging roof. The facade of the building is very long. So to give a grain and introduce a human scale, we designed three-dimensional ceramic tiles so that the surfaces would pick up the multiple light conditions and begin to really articulate the facade. And of course, we were inspired by Portugal's rich tradition of craft and ceramics. To add a further layer of depth to the 15,000 tiles that we have, we used a Crackle Glaze. It's a technique that dates back to the Song dynasty in China and was the result of an accident in the kiln. Realizing the delicacy and complexity of this accidental effect, ceramicists in the 13th century devised a way to reproduce it intentionally. And we deliberately chose a very neutral color for the glaze because it's the light in this place that brings the color. And this is what happens at sunset. It's literally as though the building is on fire with this extraordinary golden glow. And at dusk, it almost looks like it's made of pewter. And there's this magic moment at the top of the steps. And I wish I could say we'd actually designed it, but it was accidental. When you stand below the overhang of the roof, you can literally hear the sound of the waves in the water reflected from above. And then in another unexpected moment that we simply could not have imagined, when a group of musicians used the ceramic tiles of the facade as a musical instrument. Moving to my hometown, London, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. The original way into the museum is a rather grand entrance on Cromwell Road, a main traffic artery that runs east-west. And our task was to design a second entrance off Exhibition Road that runs north-south, as well as a vast space for the museum's headline shows. It was the biggest project the museum have undertaken in over 100 years and is emblematic of their progressive ethos, and maybe progress in more ways than one. This photograph from 1863 is of the Viennese original architects and engineers. More than 150 years later, in exactly the same place, a photograph of my team and our engineers. This was the site for the competition that we went on to win. It's a forgotten space of the museum, and it was used for plant and for storage. I think it's important to remember what could have been, because before our competition, there was another one on the exact same site, which Daniel Libeskind won in 1996. When that design was eventually scrapped in 2004, for me, it marked the end of the era of building as Icon. So when we made our competition proposition in 2011, we took the polar opposite view and talked about the iconography of public space. Exhibition Road is the home of 3 museums, as well as Imperial College and the Royal Albert Hall. The street had been newly pedestrianised, but there was nowhere to step off the main drag. And we saw a fantastic opportunity here to take the street into the museum and take the museum out onto the street. But to do this, there was a huge barrier to overcome. The stone screen facing onto Exhibition Road was a very important part of the museum's heritage. It was originally built to hide the boiler rooms, but they've long since gone. So we took a very big risk with our competition proposal. We argued that the key to the success of this project and of the new entrance required a radical alteration of the Grade 1 listed screen, as its purpose was no longer to hide, but to reveal. And when we won the competition, we then had to make this argument to the planners and the heritage bodies and persuade them that the social imperatives of opening up access in a literal and metaphorical way overrode the conservation arguments. And when we first presented this to them, they simply said no. So we went away. We did not change our design. What we changed was the way we presented the case. In the V&A's archive, we found this drawing, Aston Webb's original competition entry for the site, where you can see that the screen is much more open and there's a garden behind it. And when we found this drawing, I knew we had them, because during construction of Aston Webb's screen, they ran out of money, like we all do now. And the boiler rooms, which were designed to go underground, were actually built above ground. And so the screen had to be made solid to hide them. We won the argument, and the screen is now repurposed as a colonnade. And it was this urban move that unlocked the potential of the project, creating a public courtyard that invites you to drift in off to the street and then into the new entrance hall, which we've placed inside the original structure. We've taken down walls and we've opened up the windows to let the light in. But all of this was far from straightforward. We had to literally prop up the facades of the historic museum while keeping it open to the public, dig a very deep basement and pile 25 meters down. Now, usually with a deep basement, you have a huge superstructure on top, but here we just had a courtyard. And Cambridge University, who worked closely with Arup, the amazing engineers for this project, were so taken with the structural audacity that they asked if, purely as a piece of research and at their expense, they could install fiber optic monitoring cables in the tension piles, because they believe that the relative movements that will be recorded may disprove some aspects of the elastic theory, which is how this kind of thing is calculated. So without realizing it, we may have advanced engineering knowledge. In order to enter and descend through the original structure, we had to underpin a wing of the museum. And you can see that these columns and beams are literally supporting the weight of history. So we wanted to paint them a color to signify the gravitas of the engineering. International orange was the color of the first aircraft so that they could be seen against the color of the sky. And it's also the color of the San Francisco Bridge. So it's associated with engineering prowess. And we manipulated the daylight here so that you would always have a view of where you came from as you go down the stairs. And at the bottom of the stairs, there's this magic moment of daylight to make you feel comfortable in this subterranean gallery. The folded plate structure here spans 40 meters, and it supports not just the courtyard above, but all the services and equipment needed to create the museum's immersive headline shows. And we created the opportunity to let in light, although they rarely do. You can just see the grey structure in the ceiling here, but as this Dior exhibition demonstrates, the gallery is a supremely flexible volume. And it's now an altogether more informal way of entering a museum. We placed the Café in the Sun to the right of this image and then persuaded the V&A to open it outside of the museum's opening hours to better connect it to the city. And in the foreground is the oculus revealing the folded structure and allowing you to look down into the gallery below ground. And it's really clear that this repurposed screen has opened up a completely new view onto the street. We then wanted to give the courtyard a very special character. So taking inspiration from the V&A's mission of marrying arts and crafts with industry, we worked with Tikkela, the oldest business in the Netherlands, and designed with them the world's first porcelain courtyard. In effect, what we did was set out to investigate the potential and the limits of porcelain, and then to recontextualize it in the design of the courtyard tiles. And we looked at the glazes from the Chinese Song dynasty of the 10th and 11th century. It took months of research with real artisans to get where we wanted. And we used the slip casting technique to produce these beautiful tiles where the blue glaze is offset by the very whiteness of the porcelain. And then we were so emboldened with the results, we tried to push it a bit further and extrude the porcelain for the cafe roof tiles. But there's a reason people don't extrude porcelain, and that is because it doesn't work. But it's the porcelain that really lightens the whole place, lightens the courtyard, and lifts the very earthy colours of the heritage brick facades. The way that the public use the courtyard now has been transformative. It has changed the way people see the museum and the way that the institution sees itself. And just like in Lisbon, it's sometimes the things that you don't do that allows the unexpected to happen. And that's why we didn't clutter the courtyard with all the paraphernalia that goes with an entrance, and why we kept it as flat as possible to let the public appropriate the space. And also just to let the life of the city into the museum, because although the courtyard is a space owned by the museum, it very much belongs to the public. And since the new entrance opened, visitor numbers at the V&A, and this is pre-pandemic, were up 23% at a time when museum numbers in London were in decline. And I think that really speaks to the value of creating public urban space in a cultural context. Of course, what is much more of a challenge is how to do this in the commercial sector, where retail has been ravaged by the accelerated shift to online shopping. And this is Oxford Street, once London's flagship shopping destination. But the perfect storm of the pandemic, combined with a trend for online shopping, has forced many department stores to close, leaving these vast shipwrecks in the high street, along with a huge loss of jobs. So we've been thinking about what kind of activities could animate this somewhat problematic space to make it attractive and exciting to today's public. And in this project, we want to question the very nature of public space inside buildings. Can we speak to community values, not just through design, but through the programming within buildings? So our first thought was to open up the ground floor as a through route, as a kind of food market where stalls with food so that you can eat together. And we've begun to imagine growing a community around the theme of food, because it's food that brings people together, because integrating the urban and the natural has never been more important. As a consequence of the pandemic, there's now a newfound respect for science. And it was nanotechnology that inspired a research project that we embarked on pre-COVID. It's a collaboration with a professor of biological physics at Oxford University. And with this project, we're rethinking how to use nature's strategies in trees to grow the materials of the future. by extracting the lignin from wood, manipulating the cellulose structure, and infusing bioresins, we aim to take the research out of the lab and to make a material that is stronger than steel, a better insulator than glass, and that lets the light in. It is, in effect, transparent wood. And in times of crisis, there's a tendency to retreat into the comfort of what we know. But we must resist this, and we must continue to dream. And this is what this project's all about. Because if we can reconcile nature and technology, perhaps one day we can find a way to build that is positive for our environment. The Maggie's Cancer Care Centres go to the very heart of what architecture is about. They're about creating spaces that are uplifting, calming, that lighten your mood. And the site we had at Southampton was hugely challenging, a set of nondescript hospital buildings surrounded by a sea of car park. So our solution was to try and bring a bit of magic to the place. We wanted to imagine that there used to be a piece of the New Forest here, which we literally carved into to make space for the building. It's a very simple plan, a central space from which all the other spaces radiate, surrounded by nature. And we use ceramics again by Comella, the same people who made the tiles in Lisbon. And ceramics right here because it's a material that comes from the earth and it plays very well with nature. This ceramic blade wall is what leads you into the center, where we really want to create this oasis of calm. And it's the soft light from the roof that marks the center of this space, where cancer patients and their families can be together with other people who are going through the same experience. Off this central space are the more private spaces, but always with a view of nature and where you can no longer see the car park. And the ceramic walls sometimes become shelves, and here they hold a poetry collection specially selected by the artist Edmund de Waal. And each side of the ceramic blade is a different color. It's always soft and a muted color, but sometimes it just reveals the color of the clay. But we did something different here. We used the ceramic structurally to support the roof, and this involved months of trial and error, as it's not something that's been done before. But learning from our experience at Lisbon, we knew that to give a gloss to the glaze, because it picks up the different lights and it reflects the shadows of the trees. And as much as possible, we wanted the building to feel as though it had grown from the landscape. And we've picked colours here that correspond even with the bark of the trees, and used a really rippled surface to the stainless steel cladding so that it gives a much more subtle, nuanced reading of the landscape, and that captures the rays of the sun in a really lovely way. In this final project, we're literally putting the sun in a box. Our client, General Fusion, are developing the world's first targeted magnetized fusion facility. Now, fusion is the process that powers the sun and the stars, and it has the potential to provide the planet with low-cost, zero-carbon energy forever. Through the design of this building, what we want to do is inspire the public about fusion's potential and remove the fear. The architecture of this prototype plant needs to capture the technological optimism of fusion to solve the energy problems of the world. And as the first facility of its kind to be built, this needs to be visible and to be seen. I mean, this is what architects do. We message big ideas through buildings without the need for words. The exhibition spaces, the offices and the labs, they're all arranged around the central fusion island in a radial pattern with a view of both the science inside and the landscape outside. This is so much more than just a silent container. We're literally using architecture here to show a commitment and a belief in the future. And I guess ultimately, that's what architecture is about for me. Thank you.